This machine is a sliding compound miter saw, or called a chop saw. It's used for cutting boards to length or cutting angles on pieces of wood. It has a number of controls or locks. This is the lockdown mode where the saw is all the way down. And to release that, there's this little button that's under the motor, which can be hard to find sometimes. You have to push down on the saw a little bit, pull that out, and the saw will go up to its sort of normal operating position. The saw swings left and right and tips left and right. That's why it's called the compound miter saw, so it can cut two angles at once. It's meant to cut from the front to the back. So if you have a wide board, you're going to pull the saw all the way forward, lower it down all the way, push it back, release the trigger, and then let it come up. When you're trying to adjust this, it has a number of locks. So this is the main lock right here. This down is locked. When you lift it up, it's released. This doesn't move until you push this smaller button in the middle, in the front here. And that's releasing a pin that locks down into certain notches in the arc here to common angles. So it's locking it in at 90 degrees to the back, or at 0 on the scale. And then there are other notches at 22.5 degrees, half of 45 degrees, and at 45 degrees. So common angles, that spring-loaded button will lock in. If you want to go to some other angle that isn't a sort of common angle, you can set it from the pointer on the dial here to the number of degrees, but then you have to push the main lock down to lock it firmly in place before you make a cut. Lift the lock up, you can move it until you get to a notch, then you have to push the button down, and allows you to move it where you want. If you want to negate that whole spring pin thing so you can move it without it locking in at any set angle, you have to lift up this little lever right here. You push that back down, the spring-loaded lock will engage to go to the common angles. It also, the saw moves left and right and has a lock in the back here on the side. And there's a little, there's a padlock that's in the lock position and open position. So when you pull this lever towards you, lift it, it allows the saw to tilt left or to the right. If you're going to do something that has it tip over all the way to 45 degrees, you have to move this back fence. It has a lock in the back here. There's another little knob. You have to slide this out so that when the saw tips over all the way to 45 degrees, you don't start cutting the aluminum guard. And then if you're doing some odd angle that's not, this also has sort of a locks in at common angles, but if you're doing some other angle that's not a common one, you have to lock in the angle with this lever handle on the back here to lock it in at some, other angle you're choosing. There also is a little knob here in the back which will prevent the saw from sliding in and out, and that usually should be left loose so that the saw can move in and out, because that's sort of its normal operation mode. But sometimes people tighten that and the saw, you'll find, doesn't move. You have to loosen the little knob on the back here. So I'm going to return the saw to 90 degrees, lock that in. And another important thing about this saw is that pieces of wood that you're cutting need to touch the table and the back firmly. I'm going to slide this back in now. To be cut safely. If your board is bowed and it's bowed up in the middle and not touching the table right here. When you go to cut, it'll work fine until you get to the very end. And then right at the very end, the board will have so little wood left, it will start to settle down because there's no support under it, and it's going to pinch on the blade, and the blade is going to have the power to like make the saw jump a lot, and it'll be pretty scary. Same is true for if it's touching in the back. It needs to touch firmly in the back. If the board is bowed out this way, it's not touching. When you cut fine till you get to the very end, and then the board will sort of become weak at the very last second, and the board will pinch in on the saw here, and it will cause that to jump. So you need to make sure it's touching here and here when you go to make a cut. If it's not, either flip the board over so that it is touching, or you can also put another piece of wood underneath the board so that it's firmly touching the table. Actually, you need to have something a little bit bigger than this, but you could put a piece of plywood down or something like that so that it is firmly touching, and spin the board around if it's not touching in the back so that it does touch. The place to make your mark when you measure, there's supposed to be a tape measure right here at the saw all the time. There's a little spot for it to hook on. Go to make a measurement. You're going to want to make your mark on the front edge of the board because the saw is going to cut from front to back. So by having your mark right there, it's going to make it the easiest to line up your cut. Before you make a cut, this saw has a little trick that sometimes it's hard to push it down. You have to sometimes push this guard up just like an inch, and then it will work normally. But you pull the saw forward without the saw under power. You line up the saw on the mark, and the saw is got to be to the waist side of your mark because it takes a little bit of wood away, not quite 1/8 of an inch. So you line it up so that the saw is going to cut where you want it. Then you're firmly holding the board 4 inches away from the cutting path. You're going to turn the saw on, drop it all the way down, push it all the way back, and release the trigger before you pick it back up. If you don't release the trigger, keep it powered. When you pick it back up, it can catch the scrap piece that you just cut off and send it shooting across the shop. So it's important to release the trigger before you let the saw come up through the table and through the piece of work. Okay? So now I'm going to turn on the dust collector and we'll make a cut. Got the gate open. We have a bin for scrap down below the machine where you can put that there. If the bin is full, you can text me to say that it's full. If you want to use any of that scrap wood for firewood or anything, you're welcome to take pieces home. When you're done with the machine, you will want to vacuum off the sawdust and make sure that you set it back at 0, left or right, and 90 degrees up and down. If you leave it with just a little bit of an angle, next person might make the mistake thinking it's at a 90 degrees angle and start cutting. So you want to try to leave it the way you found it at 90 degrees in both directions.